Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're looking at the final chapter of Genesis, chapter 30. And it's quite the conclusion. We're closing the book not just on Jacob's family saga, but on the entire foundational text of Genesis itself.
That's right. And Genesis 50 isn't just tying up loose ends. It takes this whole long history marked by, well, betrayal, deception, famine, family breakdown.
All of that.
And it somehow transforms it into this incredibly profound statement of theological resolution. It's really quite remarkable.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We're diving deep into Genesis 50 today. It's a chapter that feels saturated with so much intense personal grief, high-stakes diplomacy, and then that ultimate, absolutely necessary act of familial forgiveness. Our sources really give us a comprehensive, kind of layered analysis. We're moving beyond just the narrative, the story of a death and a burial, to explore the huge emotional, cultural, and spiritual depth of this moment. It's a real pivot point in the covenant history.
It really is. You could say it's literally where the story of this single, very flawed family unit sort of ends, and the story of the nation of Israel as a people begins.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating here, I think, is that Genesis 50 functions as much more than just, say, an epilogue. It is, in many ways, the complete theological summary of the entire patriarchal narrative.
Interesting. How so?
Well, if you look at the structure, the chapter kind of cascades across three critical, distinct moments. First, you've got this magnificent state pageantry surrounding Jacob's death and burial. That whole event fundamentally reasserts the family's claim to Canaan.
Okay.
Second, there's the final crucial reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers. That resolves decades of, frankly, debilitating guilt and fear.
Right, that lingering tension.
Exactly. And third, you have Joseph's own death, which then anchors Israel's future hope, even while they're still in a foreign land, in Egypt. This chapter, it really serves as a kind of narrative seal, confirming that God's original promises endured despite, and maybe even more remarkably, through generations of human failure.
Right, through the messiness. Okay, let's start with that first part then. The patriarch's pageantry, the mourning and the mandate.
Yeah.
The narrative opens with this incredibly intimate moment, doesn't it? It's immediate, powerful, personal grief. Jacob dies, and Joseph, well, he doesn't hold back.
Not at all.
The text says he threw himself on his father's face, wept over him, kissed him. It's just raw filial piety, emotional honesty, a necessary personal pause, it feels like, before the machinery of state kicks in.
And that's a great point, because you see the shift almost immediately after that intimate moment. Joseph snaps right back into his role as the vizier of Egypt.
Yeah, the switch.
It demonstrates his really remarkable ability to blend his deeply felt Hebrew identity with his very powerful Egyptian office.
Right.
He commands his servants, the royal physicians, to embalm Israel.
Meaning Jacob, yeah.
Right, Jacob. He's respecting not only his father's specific final wish, which was to be buried back in the Promised Land.
Sure, she'll wish.
But he's also honoring the customs of the powerful culture that had essentially adopted him.
So let's dig into that embalming a bit, the historical, the cultural significance. Our sources point out this practice was usually reserved for, like, the absolute highest echelon of Egyptian society royalty, top officials.
Precisely.
What do the specific timeframes tell us? It mentions 40 days for the embalming itself and then 70 days for the mourning. What does that signal about Joseph's standing?
Oh, well, those numbers are absolutely crucial for understanding the sheer level of honor Jacob received. The 40 days, that represents the lengthy technical process of preservation itself. It was a period of dedication, meticulous work by these specialized Egyptian physicians.
Okay.
But the 70 days of national mourning by the Egyptians, that is extraordinary, utterly extraordinary for a foreign.
Really?
Yes. That length of time, according to historical sources, was almost identical to the period of state mourning reserved for Egyptian pharaohs, for royalty.
Wow.
So this wasn't just a polite gesture from Pharaoh. It was a massive public acknowledgement of Joseph's immense, almost unprecedented influence in the court. Think about it. The patriarch of a foreign, nomadic family was being mourned almost as if he were a high Egyptian official himself.
That really underscores the cultural intersection, doesn't it? And the elevated status the Hebrews must have enjoyed, at least during that period in Goshen.
Absolutely. That blend of customs, it continues right into the logistics of the funeral journey itself. Joseph, the second most powerful man in Egypt, he couldn't just march out with his father's body.
Right, there was protocol.
Exactly. Because of the ritual purity required by his mourning dress, he was ritually unclean. In a sense, he had to carefully follow Pharaoh's protocol. He approached Pharaoh's court through his advisors.
Indirectly.
Indirectly, yes, to seek explicit permission to travel to Canaan. And that adherence, even in his grief, shows incredible self-control and respect for the governing authority.
That's a good point. It really transforms the funeral from just a family affair into something much bigger. Like you said, a massive public witness, even a high diplomatic event.
It was absolutely a diplomatic event. This wasn't a private carriage trip. The sources describe a veritable royal entourage.
Who was included?
A great number of Pharaoh's officials, high counselors, advisors, senior officers of Egypt, they all went with Joseph. Plus, his entire household, except, the young children and the flocks and herds they left back in Goshen.
Okay.
And they traveled with an impressive military escort. The text mentions both chariots and horsemen. It was a monumental state-sponsored procession.
So it's making a huge statement.
A huge statement, publicly demonstrating the wealth, the status, the stability of this family unit. And importantly, publicly asserting Israel's identity and their claim to that ancestral land before the entire region of Canaan.
It's fascinating how the sources highlight the journey itself, too. The slow, solemn pilgrimage, moving from Egypt, the land of provision, but also exiled back towards the memory, the promise of the promised land.
Yes. And they don't go straight to Machpelah. They stop short. They travel to the threshing floor of Atad, which is somewhere near the Jordan River.
Right. And there,
they observed 7 days of intense, deep mourning. A loud public lamentation. It was like a final ceremonial farewell before the actual burial.
And this stop has a lasting impact, doesn't it? It even gets renamed.
It does. This is where the cultural impact became permanent, memorialized right there in the landscape. The local residents, the Canaanites, they witnessed this grievous week-long mourning spectacle.
And because of the huge entourage.
Exactly. Because of the vast retinue, the Egyptian officials, their dress, the solemnity of it all, the Canaanites just assumed this was an Egyptian state funeral for some important Egyptian.
Makes sense.
So consequently, they renamed the place Abel Mizraim, which translates to mourning of the Egyptians.
Wow, so the Hebrews look like Egyptians.
Precisely. This observation highlights a really significant, maybe often overlooked, social point. The Hebrews, after decades of integration, and obviously Joseph's high status, they appeared, at least superficially, almost indistinguishable from the most powerful members of their host culture. Their distinct covenantal identity was, at least for that moment, kind of obscured by their powerful assimilation into the Egyptian world.
But the whole point of this massive diplomatic procession, the ultimate purpose, was actually to powerfully reestablish that very covenantal identity, wasn't it? By burying Jacob in the right place.
Exactly. Jacob was finally laid to rest in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre.
And that location, you said earlier, is theologically the most crucial moment in this whole section.
It is. This fulfills Jacob's dying wish, number one. But number two, it functions as this powerful physical covenantal anchor. The act of burying Jacob there asserts the family's legal and theological claim to Canaan, the land God promised Abraham way back.
Right, the land purchased by Abraham.
The very land. And think about the tension here. The entire family is living pretty comfortably back in Goshen. They know their immediate future, their prosperity. It's tied to Egypt. Yet they drag their father's embalmed body hundreds of miles across the desert.
Yeah, it's a huge effort.
To bury him in a piece of land they don't currently inhabit, they don't control. This act roots the Israelite memory firmly in the Promised Land, even while they're living in exile. It was a physical manifestation of faith.
So it's affirming that the generational promises, the land grant, were still valid, still immutable, regardless of where they were currently living.
Exactly. Regardless of their circumstances. This whole pageant serves as a public declaration. While we're finding provision in Egypt, our ultimate identity, our ultimate hope is fixed somewhere else.
Okay. So the moment they turn their backs on Machpelah, having completed this huge public and private act, the focus shifts immediately, doesn't it? It snaps right back to the psychological state of the living brothers.
Oh, that transition is massive. You almost get psychological whiplash reading it. We go from this grand state funeral, attended by Pharaoh's court, back to this quiet, simmering, crippling fear among the brothers.
Because the buffer is gone.
The buffer is gone. The father, Jacob, who was kind of the binding agent, the one who imposed peace and maybe ensured Joseph's protective mantle over them. He's now gone.
And this is where, as you said, it gets really interesting psychologically. The brothers' first thought, right after returning to Egypt from the burial, it's recorded in Genesis 50.15. And it's just paralyzing fear. What if Joseph is carrying a grudge?
Hmm.
What if he decides now is the time to pay us back for all the wrong we did him? I mean, after decades of his kindness, his provision, this apparent reconciliation, why? Why did this crippling toxic fear suddenly bubble back up?
It reveals such a profound psychological truth, doesn't it?
Yeah.
About the persistence of unaddressed, maybe unconfessed guilt. The brothers' fear shows that despite the practical reconciliation, despite the relief from famine, the deep-seated moral injury they inflicted on Joseph, it remained unresolved in their own consciences.
So it wasn't about Joseph, it was about them.
It was entirely about them. They were operating under the assumption of what you might call transactional justice.
Yeah.
An eye for an eye. Bad actions must be met with proportional revenge.
Okay.
They projected their own past malicious intent onto Joseph. They assumed he was just, biding his time, waiting for the authoritative buffer Jacob to be removed before he finally unleashed his retribution. Their inability to accept genuine, unconditional forgiveness. It just speaks volumes about the heavy, persistent burden of a guilty conscience.
And to try and manage this fear, they resort to this. Well, it seems like a desperate, frankly questionable maneuver.
It does.
They send a messenger notice. They still can't approach him directly, which really shows the depth of their terror.
Good point.
And they send this messenger with an alleged command from Jacob, something like, "Before your father died, he instructed us to say to you, 'Forgive your brothers for the great evil they did to you.'" Now, this command sounds highly suspect, doesn't it? If Jacob had really issued this, wouldn't Joseph have already known?
That's absolutely right. The timing, the indirectness, it all feels a bit off. The potential fabrication, or at the very least a severe embellishment, of Jacob's dying wish highlights their utter desperation.
They're grasping at straws.
Totally. They're trying to use the authority of the deceased patriarch to basically enforce a forgiveness they hadn't yet truly believed in or felt secure in. And notice the wording, too. They address themselves as the servants of the God of thy father. They're trying to frame the requested forgiveness not just as, family grace, but as a spiritual imperative. They're essentially trying to manipulate Joseph using the spiritual language of the covenant, hoping this maneuver would provide protection, where Joseph's own demonstrated character for years had somehow failed to reassure them.
Which is just tragic, really. And Joseph's response to this manipulation, this fear, this appeal to his father's memory, it's one of the most poignant, illuminating moments in the whole book, I think. He just breaks down.
He breaks down and weeps profoundly. But we have to ask, why is he weeping?
Right. Is it anger? Frustration?
I don't think so. The sources suggest he wasn't weeping out of anger or frustration, or even just annoyance at their lack of trust. He was weeping out of sorrow, deep sorrow over their enduring, debilitating fear and their distrust.
So his forgiveness was real.
Utterly. His tears confirm that his forgiveness, the forgiveness he offered years earlier when they first reunited during the famine, had been completely genuine. He was heartbroken that they still viewed him as a potential executioner, that they still failed to grasp the depth of his transformation, his grace, and think of the sadness that they had spent decades living under this crippling psychological burden of unreleased guilt.
It really speaks to that painful reality, doesn't it? That forgiveness offered isn't always forgiveness received, or at least forgiveness believed.
Precisely. And then, following that message, the brothers finally do come to him in person. They drop all pretense. They threw themselves down before him, physically prostrating themselves, declaring, "We are your slaves."
Wow. Total submission.
Total submission. This posture was obviously meant to appease his perceived wrath. And in doing so, maybe ironically, they completely and definitively fulfilled that original divisive dream prophecy from Genesis 37, the one that got him into trouble in the first place.
Yeah, the sheaves bowing down, the star.
Exactly. Their complete submission now sets the stage for Joseph's absolutely masterful reply. And he immediately pivots the entire discussion away from human fear and human vengeance towards a divine theological perspective.
Okay, what does he say?
His immediate reassurance is vital. Fear not. Just cuts right through their terror. But then he sets this crucial theological boundary. Am I in the place of God?
Right.
Am I God to judge and punish you? Vengeance is his, not mine. He absolutely refuses to take on the mantle of the Almighty to exact retribution.
That shows incredible maturity.
Immense psychological and spiritual maturity. He moves beyond his personal grievance, he relinquishes the right to bitterness, and he recognizes that true, ultimate justice belongs solely in God's jurisdiction. This is the victory of grace over the very natural human desire for vengeance.
And that boundary setting, that am I in the place of God, leads directly into probably the most famous line in the chapter, maybe in Joseph's whole story. It provides the interpretive lens for his entire life of suffering.
It really does.
After clarifying his role, refusing to be God, Joseph delivers his theological thesis. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. To bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. Genesis 50.20. Let's unpack that statement.
This statement is, I think, the definitive foundation for understanding what theologians later call the doctrine of double agency.
Double agency.
It performs this incredibly complex, yet elegantly simple theological maneuver. It tightly weaves together two seemingly contradictory truths: God's absolute sovereignty and human moral agency, human responsibility.
How does it do that?
Well, Joseph doesn't deny the brothers' culpability at all. He says it plainly. You meant evil. They intended harm, and they absolutely must bear the moral blame for their actions. He doesn't excuse them.
Right, no whitewashing.
No whitewashing. But at the same time, God's providence, his overarching plan for redemption, was working through their sinful actions. God transformed the consequences of their evil towards a profound covenantal purpose, securing the preservation of life, saving the family, saving Egypt, saving many people during that devastating famine.
So God used their evil for his good purpose.
Exactly. It's the ultimate expression of God's redemptive power, his astonishing ability to take human trauma, injustice, malice, betrayal, and somehow use those very things as the tools to fulfill his promises.
Now, that is a cornerstone statement, but is there a risk we might be reading too much theology back into it? I mean, do the sources suggest Joseph consciously understood this as double agency, or is that more of a later theological framework we're imposing?
That's a really crucial question to ask. I think the language Joseph himself uses, that very deliberate parallel structure, you want evil, God meant it for good, suggests a deep personal revelation. This wasn't just an off-the-cuff remark. It feels like a hard-won synthesis of his entire life's suffering.
Okay.
So while the formal term double agency is definitely a later theological construct, Joseph clearly articulates the functional reality of it. He saw the hand of God actively guiding the trajectory of his life, not just, cleaning up the mess afterwards.
So he saw God's hand in the bad things.
Yes. He connects the specific evil act, the betrayal, being thrown in the pit, sold into slavery, directly to the specific good outcome, the salvation of the family. He recognized that the very act of being thrown into the pit, being sold to Potiphar, being falsely accused, being placed in prison, these weren't just random bad luck or unfortunate events. They were the detailed, orchestrated steps God used to position him as the vizier, precisely so he could save many people. The theology seems explicit, right there in his own words.
That's powerful. The sources also emphasize that the conflict here wasn't just sibling rivalry writ large. It was an unseen spiritual battle with cosmic stakes. Can you elaborate on that? What were the higher-level forces potentially at play behind this betrayal?
Well, think about it. The spiritual battle was fundamentally over covenant fidelity and God's chosen destiny for this family line. The intense hatred, the jealousy, the attempt to literally erase Joseph, who was the favored son, the one carrying these messianic-tinged dreams.
Right. The dreams pointed to leadership.
Exactly. Those human actions were arguably the outworking of spiritual forces that sought to derail God's entire covenantal plan. If Joseph had been killed, as the brothers initially intended, the path to forming the nation of Israel, and eventually the coming of the Messiah through that line, would have been drastically altered, perhaps even destroyed from a human perspective.
So Genesis 50 represents a win in that battle.
Absolutely. Genesis 50 presents a definitive spiritual victory. Joseph's act of forgiveness dismantles the power of guilt that had held his brothers captive. It breaks the cycle of retribution and violence that had plagued Abraham's family for generations. Think Cain and Abel, Ishmael and Isaac, Jacob and Esau.
It's a recurring theme.
It is. This act of mercy is essentially spiritual warfare. It reclaims relational ground through grace, demonstrating powerfully that God's redemptive purposes can and do outmaneuver evil intent every single time.
Building on that idea of God's larger plan, Joseph's life is often analyzed typologically, meaning he functions as a kind of prophetic picture or a type of a future greater figure. Let's make that connection to Christ more specific.
Yes, the typological parallels are really undeniable and quite profound. They kind of structure the rest of redemptive history, in a way.
So.
Okay, so Joseph was beloved by his father, Jacob. Christ is the beloved son of the Heavenly Father. Joseph was betrayed by his own people, his brothers. Christ was rejected by his own people, Israel. Joseph was sold for a price, 20 pieces of silver. which echoes Judas's 30 pieces for betraying Christ. Joseph suffered unjustly, thrown first into a literal pit, then into the figurative pit of prison under false accusations. This mirrors Christ's suffering, death, and burial.
Okay.
Then Joseph was exalted from the lowest point, the prison cell, to the position of ultimate power in the known world at the time, vizier of Egypt. This mirrors Christ's resurrection and ascension to the right hand of the Father.
And the purpose of that exaltation.
Crucially, Joseph used that power to save his family, and indeed much of the world, from the deadly famine. Christ used his exalted power to redeem humanity from sin and death. And Joseph's final act here in Genesis 50, forgiving the undeserving, those who caused him the most searing pain. It's a beautiful reflection of Christ's passion and his redemptive work on the cross, offering forgiveness to those who crucified him. Joseph really is the rejected brother who becomes the saving grace for his people.
And the forgiveness he offers here, it isn't just philosophical or verbal, is it? It's tangible. It's active provision. He's restoring their social and emotional stability. He promises, I will nourish you and your little ones.
That phrase, I will nourish you, is absolutely essential. It tells us that true forgiveness, true reconciliation, isn't passive. It's not just saying, I forgive you and walking away. It requires proactive investment in rebuilding trust and ensuring the security of those who wronged you.
So it's more than just words.
Much more. True reconciliation demands action, protection, provision. Joseph ensures their financial stability, their physical safety, their food security. And that's really the only way to genuinely mend those decades-old relational bonds and secure the family's future together in Egypt. This chapter, in that sense, offers a complete blueprint for reconciliation. It requires honest confession from the guilty party.
Which the brothers finally offered in their fear.
Yes. It requires compassionate leadership from the one who was wronged, which Joseph models perfectly. And it requires active, continuous provision to rebuild the relational infrastructure that was destroyed by the original offense.
Okay, so the story then concludes, moving decades after this reconciliation, focusing on Joseph's final years and his death. He lives to be 110 years old. And the sources highlight that this was considered the ideal lifespan in Egypt, signifying a life of complete fulfillment, prosperity, wisdom.
Yes, reaching 110 was sort of the Egyptian equivalent of a life well lived, blessed by the gods or God.
And he saw his lineage firmly established too, didn't he? Seeing Ephraim's children into the third generation, even adopting Matir's children from Manasseh, he seems totally integrated into the land, successful by every Egyptian measure. Yet his final thoughts remain fixed on the future, back towards Canaan.
Absolutely. This is Joseph's final monumental act of faith. And it's an act that profoundly guides the nation's identity for the next, 4 centuries, right up until the Exodus. On his deathbed, he delivers his final prophecy and his final mandate to his family, to the assembled sons of Israel. He says, God will surely visit you.
That word visit feels significant.
It is. It implies divine intervention, a coming to the rescue. God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land, Egypt, to the land he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. He knew Egypt was temporary. He knew the promise of Canaan was eternal. And he fixed their gaze firmly upon that future coming of God, the visit.
And he didn't just give them a verbal prophecy, he made them swear an oath, didn't he? A solemn binding oath about his body.
Yes, the famous oath of the bones. He makes the sons of Israel swear that they will carry his bones with them when God finally leads them out of Egypt. An oath, remarkably, that they remembered and fulfilled some 400 years later when Moses led the Exodus.
The symbolism there and just the practical weight of that oath is staggering. Joseph died, he was embalmed according to Egyptian custom, and his body was placed in a coffin in Egypt.
Right, not buried immediately in Canaan like his father.
No. So that preserved, silent body, sitting in a coffin for centuries in a foreign land. What did that represent?
It became this tangible, constant link to the covenant land. A persistent, silent testimony to the promise. Think about the generations that followed Joseph. Many of them grew comfortable in Egypt, perhaps assimilated, maybe forgot their distinct heritage as the oppression grew later. But that coffin was always there.
A physical reminder.
A physical reminder that while they might find comfort or later suffering in the world, represented by Egypt, their true identity, their ultimate hope was fixed on the promised land, Canaan. This was an act of faith that literally transcended death itself. Joseph was actively directing the family's hope toward the future Exodus, essentially saying generation after generation, don't get too comfortable here, this is not your final home.
So if we pull back from the ancient story, how does this incredibly rich narrative relate to us today? to the complexities, the fractures of the modern world, especially maybe for individuals navigating personal trauma or deep hurt.
Well, Joseph models such a mature faith in navigating suffering, doesn't he? He encourages emotional honesty. We see him weep freely and frequently. He doesn't suppress his grief or pain.
Oh.
But he also provides this necessary theological lens for processing trauma. He models looking for God's redeeming work within the suffering, turning the mess into a message, as some say, without ever denying the reality of the injustice he suffered or minimizing the evil actions of his brothers.
So it's not about pretending the bad thing wasn't bad.
Not at all. His perspective helps individuals navigate personal hurts or even systemic injustices with a kind of resilience that's rooted in trusting God's sovereignty, trusting that God can and ultimately will bring good out of even the most difficult traumatic circumstances. It fosters a spiritual resilience.
And the reconciliation story itself seems tremendously relevant for families, for communities today, which are often just fractured by old wounds, deep-seated resentments, maybe historical injustices that go back generations.
Absolutely. The Joseph story provides a concrete, practical blueprint for resolving deep-seated conflicts. It teaches us that genuine family healing, or community healing, requires humility demonstrated, finally, by the brother's submission. It requires confession of the wrong done. It requires compassionate leadership from the one who was wronged, like Joseph showed.
And crucially,
as we discussed, it requires that active provision to actually mend the relational bonds. You can't just say sorry. You have to demonstrate the change. Furthermore, thinking socially or even nationally, that tension Joseph navigated living in Egypt with its worldly comforts, its economic stability, but also its pressures towards assimilation while keeping focus on Canaan.
Yeah.
That resonates deeply today, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does.
It highlights that perennial challenge for people of faith, or any group with strong core values. How do you balance cultural integration, living in the world, with unwavering fidelity to your foundational identity, your covenantal commitments?
Mm-hmm. Even the public spectacle of the funeral, uniting Egyptians and Hebrews in mourning, it speaks to the possibility of respect across cultural lines. But Joseph's bones ensured the Israelite core identity remained fixed on the promise, not just on the temporary comfort or discomfort of the host nation.
Well said.
Now, this chapter, Genesis 50, is often positioned as a profound source of help and encouragement, specifically for believers in Christ. How does Joseph's example speak to that?
Well, Joseph's remarkable ability to forgive, to release that natural need for vengeance, his mature, non-transactional forgiveness, it's clearly rooted not in his own inner strength or willpower, but in his theological certainty of God's sovereignty.
Am I in the place of God, and God meant it for good?
Precisely. That statement, God meant it for good, becomes a cornerstone of Christian hope. It assures believers that no suffering, no betrayal, no trauma is ultimately random or wasted in God's economy. God is actively orchestrating all circumstances, even the painful ones, for a greater redemptive purpose. Joseph's example provides the practical model for Christian forgiveness, the kind Paul talks about later in Ephesians. For instance, forgiving as God in Christ forgave you.
Right.
A forgiveness offered not because the other person deserves it, but because of what God has done for us. And finally, that ultimate promise of the visit and the carrying of the bones, it encourages Christians today to live as sojourners, as pilgrims in this world.
Knowing this isn't the final destination.
Exactly. Knowing our ultimate citizenship is elsewhere, holding fast to the hope of resurrection and the eternal fulfillment that awaits us in a reality far better than our present Egypt, whatever form that takes.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for us as we close the book of Genesis? It seems Genesis 50 concludes this entire patriarchal era, not with the whimper of tragedy, despite all the pain that came before.
Not at all.
But with this powerful, comprehensive statement of unwavering hope. It confirms definitively that God's redemptive plan is stronger than human sin, stronger than betrayal, stronger than generational trauma, stronger even than death itself. The final image of Genesis isn't despair. It's provision, forgiveness, and the absolute certainty that restoration is possible, even after the deepest, most foundational wounds.
That's beautifully put. Joseph's life arc is such a profound echo, a foreshadowing of Christ's. The rejected brother who, through immense suffering and then exaltation, becomes the savior and the source of life for the entire family and beyond. The core lesson hammered home throughout Genesis, and sealed here in chapter 50, is that God is always working, always faithful to his word, always fulfilling his promises. It affirms that his purposes endure despite human failings, and that forgiveness, It's not merely a polite social act. It is the ultimate act of spiritual warfare that dismantles the chains of guilt and fear.
A powerful closing thought.
And consider this. The entire nation of Israel lived for generations in Egypt, finding comfort, then facing oppression, often forgetting their heritage, perhaps. Yet Joseph's bones remained there, a preserved, silent testimony in a coffin, waiting patiently for the promise to be fulfilled. It must have taken immense recurring faith for each generation, not to just bury those bones and forget, but to leave that coffin there, reminding everyone of their temporary status.
So here's something to think about as we finish. Ask yourself, what bone, what tangible symbol of God's future promise, a promise perhaps not yet fully realized in your own life or circumstances, are you holding on to today? What serves as your silent reminder that this world, with all its comforts and crises, is not your final permanent home?